If you are looking for a versatile sculpin fly you can tie in lots of colors, throw on your 5-weight floating line, this fly is for you. Start with a wide gap hook, somewhere in the size range of 1 through 6. Here I'm going with the size 2. Take a rabbit zonker strip and cut the rear so the hide tapers to a point, making sure the direction of the hair is pointed towards the rear of the hook. I like to measure my zonker strip 1 hook shank in length, beginning with the start of the taper, and this will be your tie-in point. Separate the hair at the tie-in point. Believe me, wetting your fingers helps here. Pierce the hide of the zonker with the hook point, puncturing the zonker from the hide side. Once you've punctured your zonker with the hook point, go ahead and remove the hook from the vise and slide that zonker strip up onto the hook shank. Once that's done, go ahead and re-secure the hook in your vise. Have your hook securely back in your vise. Go ahead and slide that zonker strip down the hook shank towards the bend of the hook to make room to tie on your thread. Again, wetting your fingers helps control the hair a lot here. For this fly, I like to go with 140 denier or a 6/0 thread, which I start about an eye length behind the eye of the hook, wrapping back towards the middle of the shank. Go ahead and trim your tag end off and continue wrapping a thread base down towards the bend of the hook. I'll usually wrap my thread back right into the point where it falls right between the hook point and where the barb would be. At this point, you want to rotate your vise so the hook is now upside down. This fly actually rides hook point up, so we'll be tying the zonker in on what is actually going to be the top of the hook. Go ahead and manipulate the hair on the zonker so that the thread is hanging directly below the point on the zonker where you pierced with the hook point. Again, wetting your fingers is helpful here to separate that hair. Once you have that hair cleared from that tie-in spot, I go ahead and place 3 really good secure tight wraps here just to make sure that that zonker is really locked into place. Sometimes you have to kind of play with the hair a little bit so that you make sure you don't capture any. You got your securing wraps in, go ahead and pull that zonker back and move your thread to just in front of that tie-in point. Now you're going to go ahead and walk your thread all the way up to the starting spot on the hook and rotate your vise back into the original position so the hook point is now facing down. Sometimes I'll sweep my zonker strip back out of the way a little bit further just to make sure that there's no hair that I'm going to catch. This pattern uses small dumbbell eyes, which I measure off the eye of the hook for placement, just so I make sure that I'm always tying my eyes in consistently. I secure my dumbbell eyes using crossing wraps over the top of the eyes. I do usually 4 to 5 wraps in one direction, and then I switch and do 4 to 5 wraps in the other direction, and I'll repeat this a few times until I've got a decent number of thread wraps on those eyes. Every once in a while it's good to give a good little tug to the thread just to pull any slack out. Next we're going to move into our money wraps. These wraps don't go over the eyes, they actually go under the eyes and over the hook shank, so they are wrapping around the cross wraps that you made in the first step. I do this a handful of times, pull the slack out, a handful of times, pull some more slack out, and then go ahead and wrap your thread back to the zonker and re-rotate your vise so that it's hook point up. This next step is really kind of personal preference, but I always tend to err on the side of adding a little bit of super glue to my eyes and my thread wraps, both on the top side and the underside, just to add a little bit of extra security and durability to those actual eyes. Next, we're going to grab our next material, which is SF blend fibers. We're going to grab a sparse stack of those, and we're actually going to tie them in using a technique called V-stacking. For this technique, go ahead and start your first stack up against the zonker on the hook side nearest to you, and then secure the material just short of its midpoint with 3 to 4 good wraps. Then grab the other side of the material and pull it across the hook shank and secure on the far side of the hook. If you were to look at your fly right now from the top down, you'd see that the material is shaped in a V on the top of the hook with 1 stack on each side, hence the name of the technique, V-stacking. Move your thread forward slightly, and then you're going to actually repeat this same technique a total of 2 more times using the same color that you just secured in step 1. This third stack of that primary color should end up being tied in pretty close to those dumbbell eyes, although not right up against them. You're going to repeat this V-stacking technique one more time, but you're going to switch to a red color of SF blend fibers. If you don't have red, you can use a dark orange or something that's similar. Go ahead and tie that stack in. Same technique. You're going to tie that in right up against the back of those dumbbell eyes. I'm a little bit of a neat freak, so I like to make sure all the fibers are neatly swept back, tied in, and that tie-in point is really clean. Rotate your fly back so that it's hook point up, and make sure your tying thread is right at the back of your dumbbell eyes. Go ahead and grab the end of that zonker strip and pull tight towards the eye of the hook, using wet fingers to separate the hair right above the dumbbell eyes so you can use that as your tie-off point. Cleared the hair away from the tie-off point. Go ahead and give it a solid 3 wraps to secure it in place. Sometimes this can be a little bit tricky if the hair is not quite cooperating with you, so take your time here and make sure that you have the zonker tied off really well. Once you have your thread wraps in and the zonker secured, go ahead and trim off the excess piece of zonker that's out above the dumbbell eyes. Trim it off as close to that tie-off point as you can. Once you have that excess zonker trimmed off, go ahead and throw a few wraps in there just to clean that area up. Make a nice clean tie-off point. And then in my typical fashion, I like to hit this with a little bit of super glue just for some added durability. With our thread still right at that tie-off point, we're going to go ahead and tie in a red Sculpin feather by the tip, and then go ahead and trim off the excess once you have that tied in securely. While sweeping the fibers back on the Sculpin feather, go ahead and take 3 wraps with the feather. These wraps are going to lay one right in front of another, and you want to make sure with each wrap that you're really sweeping those fibers back. We want all those fibers going back towards the back of the fly. Once you do your 3 wraps, you're going to go ahead and secure that Sculpin feather, tie it off. Usually I'll do 2 or 3 wraps to make sure that it's secure. Once it's secure, you just go ahead and trim off that excess feather. At this point we need to clean it up a little bit, so I sweep all those fibers back, lay down a couple thread wraps so that you really make those Sculpin feather fibers lay towards the back of the fly. Next we're going to repeat that exact same process, only this time we're going to use a Sculpin feather that is the color of kind of the primary color scheme that we're tying the fly in. So here I'm going with olive. We're going to do the same exact thing. We're going to lay down 3 wraps with this Sculpin feather. Again, wraps right in front of each other, sweeping those fibers back with every wrap. Sometimes, as you see here, the fibers don't really cooperate even though you're sweeping them back, which is okay. Once you tie that feather off, you'll have an opportunity to pull those fibers back and lay down some thread wraps to kind of help them orient the way that you want them to. Once I trim out that feather, you can see it's a little bit crazy, so as I mentioned, lay down some thread wraps, just clean that up a little bit, and then I'll usually manipulate the fibers of those Sculpin feathers, just make sure everything is exactly where you want it, and then I will hit that tie-in with a little bit of super glue. Again, just a little extra durability on top of those thread wraps. Next, we're going to create a dubbing loop just behind those dumbbell eyes. If you're not familiar with dubbing loops, Fly Fishing the Ozarks has an awesome tutorial that I'll link here. But we're going to wrap that loop around our finger, secure that loop by wrapping around it twice, and then go ahead and move the thread up to the eye of the hook. Anytime I'm tying with rabbit hair in a dubbing loop, which is what we're going to do here, I like to add a little bit of Loon Low Tax wax just to help that hair stay in place, makes it easy to manipulate. Next, I'll use my Loon D-loop tweezers to cut the hair off of about a 2-inch piece of zonker. 2 inches is about what I've found to be an appropriate amount of hair for this fly. I'll go ahead and use those tweezers to insert the butt ends of the hair right into my dubbing loop there. The wax that we put on in the previous step will make it easy for the hair to stay in place, give you time to manipulate it, make sure it's even, make sure it's exactly where you like it. before you start doing your wraps. Take your time with this step too. It's really important to make sure that the hair is even, not crisscrossed, distributed appropriately throughout your dubbing loop so that it's not clumpy. Really important to take the time to make sure that it's situated properly so that you get a good head on this fly. You also want that rabbit hair as close to the top of that loop as possible. Go ahead and pinch that dubbing loop with one hand while you give it a good spin with the other hand, and you'll see that hair start to spin up and start to get real spiky and buggy looking. Usually at this point I'll use a brush or a comb or something just to kind of make sure that that hair's picked out really well, no fibers are trapped, and that you have a nice bushy rope of rabbit hair there. Just like with our wraps of Sculpin feathers, stroking the fibers back here is really important. So you're going to go ahead and wet your fingers, stroke the fibers back, and lay down 2 wraps really close together behind the dumbbell eyes. For the third wrap, I like to come under the dumbbell eyes and then land my thread right in front of the eyes, so I kind of cross over from the back to the front, really making sure I'm sweeping the fibers back, and that helps cover up the thread wraps that we have from putting our dumbbell eyes on the hook. You're going to lay down 2 to 3 more wraps in front of the eyes working towards the eye of the hook. It really kind of depends on how much hair you use. Will determine whether you get 2 or 3 wraps in here. Once you get to the eye of the hook there, go ahead and tie off that dubbing loop. I like to lay down 2 wraps and then just go ahead and trim that loop out. He's looking a little bit like the Grinch now, so we're going to go ahead and sweep those fibers back, get that tie off cleaned up a little bit, lay down a nice little thread head in front of the rabbit fur there. Your fingers manipulate the hair, make sure it's where you like it, and then I will typically do anywhere between a 3 or a 5 turn whip finish. For this fly, I landed on 5. Once you tighten that down, make sure it's secure, snip off your thread. I like to kind of run my fingers through the rabbit fur one more time, brush the fibers back, make sure everything's kind of exactly how I like it. Make sure there's no little fibers sticking off the eye or in weird places. If there are, you can trim them out. And then as the last step, I'll kind of hit it with super glue one more time, just a little tap. You don't need a lot, just to secure those thread wraps. And there it is, the Sidewinder Sculpin. I like to tie this fly in olive, black, orange, natural, and tan, but the sky's the limit. You can play with your color combos. It's a blast to tie, it's easy, it's fun to fish. So have fun and happy tying.